Thank you, Andrew. I don't think there's anything more I need to say. That was so beautifully expressed. But I am ready to speak for the next 7 hours on Van Morrison, for sure. I grew up in England, and I never dreamed I could go to war-torn Belfast until a magical company known as the Jaipur Literature Festival took me and my wife there 5 years ago. And we had a wonderful time finding that it's a vibrant global city now. It's very different from the troubles that we associate it with from the 1970s. But I never forget this one Sunday morning. We traveled out to East Belfast, which is a really broken down industrial area with long rows of tiny houses attached to each other and no sense of hope or possibility there. And we got off at C.S. Lewis Square, as you read in the book, and we walked past Cypress Avenue down to this place called Hindford Street. And I'd known my wife for 34 years then, and it was the first time I ever said, "Please, will you take a picture of me here?" Because there's a little plaque there saying that Van Morrison was born 2 weeks after the end of World War II. And the reason maybe it moved you so much, and the reason that moment moved me so much, is that there was a young man growing up without any advantages in one of the most battered and troubled places in the Western world. And most of you will know, all Van Morrison sings about is heaven. And people say he doesn't need a religion because he's got God's direct line on his smartphone. And all his music really is about possibility and recovering some paradise that's within us if only we can open our eyes to that reality and that possibility. And so just as you said, Andrew, the combination of this very bleak landscape and this vision of heaven, really, is at the heart of the book, which is my sense that the only paradise I could trust is one I would find in the middle of real life. And that, sometimes I've been lucky enough, let's say, to go to Tahiti, which is what all the travel posters present as paradise. And if you're sitting on an empty golden beach under the tropical sun with goodies being brought to you, it really feels celestial. But it's not paradise for the people around you. They're working really, really hard to tend to their visitors, and probably their vision of paradise would be Boulder, Colorado, or Santa Monica. And also, even on the brightest day, soon enough the darkness falls. And if the beach is really beautiful, it won't be so empty the next day. And those kind of paradises are very impermanent, I find. And so, as you probably intuited, I wrote this book in the middle of the pandemic, when everyone in the world was living in this state of uncertainty and anxiety. My mother was 88 and she was entering the final seasons of her life. Things couldn't have been more difficult, and my sense is that life is always difficult, but difficulty is not incompatible with wonder and hope and beauty. So how, in this divided and despairing time, can we find common ground and can we find cause for hope and inspiration? So as you said, I deliberately went to places that are not instantly appealing. Iran, North Korea, war-torn Sri Lanka, Jerusalem, which is always haunted by difficulties. Because I thought any glimpse of hope I can find there is a glimpse I can believe in. It's easy to believe in paradise when you're on top of the Himalayas, much less so when you're in Times Square or in the middle of our troubled country, and that's the place where we have to find it.
And in the same way, it's very easy to export the violence as though it's happening outside of oneself. Another moving moment I found was when you were in Ladakh and questioning whether you should be there. That in a way, Ladakh was very paradisical and, high in the Himalayas, not much industry, not much ruination of the ecologies so far, but you could almost prophetically see into the future as it becomes an increasingly touristed destination, and what it meant to be one of those people showing up there and carrying some sort of seeds of ruin. And I think that's sort of an insightful quality to your whole book, as you never leave yourself unimplicated in what's going on, that there's jostling in the streets and you're part of the jostling. There's a bristling of violence and you're right there in the midst of it.
Yes, I am a typical tourist, and I'm a typical defiler of the environment. Every traveler now has to think, what can you bring back from your long-distance journeys that can possibly justify the damage you're doing to the environment, as Sanjay was saying earlier. But Ladakh, so you know that it's almost the closest to Shangri-La we're likely to find on this earth. And there is that sense, just as you said, that humanity and perfection don't belong in the same sentence. And if this really is a pristine place, what can I hope to bring to it other than corruption?
Yeah, and for all its paradisical qualities, Ladakh, I've been told, has more Indian military there than Ladakhi population. So it's a precarious and militaristically held paradise.
Yes, and so I think two of the challenges for paradise are first that everybody wants a piece of it, as in Ladakh, and secondly that your vision of paradise is very unlikely to be mine. And so, as you used the word contested before, and so every paradise by definition is contested. And I think that's one reason why almost at the center of this book, as you saw, is Jerusalem.
Right, Jerusalem with that, the real jostling.
The real jostling. And what always moves me about Jerusalem is I'm not Christian or Jewish or Muslim, but that place can bring tears to my eyes. And it exerts a magnetism like almost nowhere on earth. I'll sometimes be walking around my neighborhood in Japan and I can feel this pull to Jerusalem because it's such a charged epicenter of worship and the possibility of transcendence. I always stay in a little Christian hospice there, and I wake up before dawn and I walk over the uneven stones to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and I sit in a little cave. There's nothing there, the flickering candle on a ledge, far from where most of the crowds are. And I don't know why, and I don't need to know why, but something in that cave goes through me, and I think goes through anyone of any background who goes there. And yet, of course, even as Jerusalem is almost synonymous with religion, it's synonymous for that reason with conflict, and has been forever, sadly.
Yeah, and not just the conflict that makes the newspapers. One of the striking details I found was when you located a chapel or a church that had services of different Christian denominations, and the description that if the Armenians were going down the stairs and the Greeks were going up, they would come to blows. And these were both Christians, and the whole city just feels in your eyes very tense there. You referred to yourself a moment ago as a tourist, and I think that's a little unfair because I think you wear many hats. And sometimes I saw you in the book as a pilgrim, like I said, in Belfast. Sometimes as an intruder in this remote area of Australia. Sometimes, as you described yourself, as rattled and unsettled in Sri Lanka. And then you went to Kashmir and talked about the tourists and your mother up in Kashmir and described yourself as one of the new tourists. So you're a tourist, you're an intruder, you're a pilgrim, you're unsettled, it's a lot of different visions and, in a way, costumes or masquerades that you have to wear as you go from place to place, often as an outsider, but sometimes as a deep insider.
Yes, well, and I think travel explodes the very notion of outsider and insider, because to some extent, even when I come to Boulder, say last night, a part of me feels very welcomed and part of this community and instantly finds connections with every member of it, such as yourself, but I'm not a true Boulderite, I'm just a person passing through. But you express that with such sensitivity. I've been reading you for 30 or 40 years, and I'm not surprised you can read my book so perfectly. But I think, yes, my sense is that in Kashmir, for example, again, a typical visitor sits on a houseboat, and people paddle past bringing wonderful spices and carved boxes and all the treasures of that great culture. And all you can hear are kingfishers whirring of wings, and you see the lotus paths beyond you. And it's truly as calm a place as I know on Earth. 10 minutes across the water, it's all the roadblocks and Indian army contention that you were describing. But there is this glimpse of something beyond, in the middle of something really hard. And you're right, I think self-implication has to be part of every traveler's project. We're never innocent, and we have to question what we're bringing to any of those places. But I sort of try to present myself as an everyman, and one thing I did in this book, which I've never done before, is in almost every chapter, as you saw, I'm at the mercy of a local guide, which is my way of saying that that person is the one behind the wheel of the car. I'm not in control. I can't anticipate. I don't have a clue. I mean, in some ways, this book is about how little I know. And if I were to go to those same places when I was in my 20s, I was a know-it-all. Oh, I can summarize Iran in 6 paragraphs. Now, the beauty of getting older is the more I confront, the more I'm humbled by it and see I can't begin to make sense of it. Even in the case of Iran, I'd studied it for 30 years, and I arrived there, and within 4 hours I saw I didn't know a thing. So I suppose the whole book is a way of trying to strip the illusion of knowledge. Because I feel that one reason our world is so divided now is people saying, I know more than you and I know better than you. And it's actually the space of unknowing, which is a space of intimacy, that brings us all together. And the reason I called it The Half-Known Life, coming from Melville, as you said, was just that the older I get, the more I find my life is defined by everything I can never know and could never explain. Suddenly I fall in love. Suddenly I step onto a terrace in the Potala Palace and I feel lifted beyond my normal self. Suddenly virus closes down the world. Suddenly my house burns down. And I think most of us know that the really significant moments that mark our lives are ones we can't begin to get our minds around. And in fact, the things that we know are this little tent in the Himalayas at dark, at night, surrounded by this vast darkness.
Yes, when you have these different people guiding you through different cities or different regions, often you have a backstory for them. The backstory opens up the nation or city for you, because often the backstory is quite tragic. And yet you watch how the people who are guiding you have accustomed themselves to this new role and become survivors, in a sense, of really debilitating circumstances in some cases. Other times, you don't even know who the people are. They come out like a cat out of the shadows and then leave you somewhere. So in a sense, they're all, to use a metaphor or a literary allusion you have in the book, they're like your Virgil. You refer in the book to Thomas Merton being your Virgil. And of course, Virgil, most people should know that he's the classical Roman who led Dante through hell, up the mountain of purgatory, but not into paradise, because he couldn't go there. He was not a Christian, so he couldn't ascend into paradise. You want to say something about Virgils and these guides and leaders for you, and maybe a few words about Thomas Merton, because he seems to be so close to your heart.
Thank you. So I'll start at the end and say that I think the two protagonists of this book are Thomas Merton and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who of course met in Dharamsala in northern India in 1968, just 4 weeks, I believe, before Merton died through electrocution. And the reason I wanted to have them at the center of this book was I was very moved that Thomas Merton, after 27 years of devotion as a Trappist monk in Kentucky, had his life-changing spiritual realization in front of some Buddhas in Sri Lanka, and was open-minded enough to see that they might guide him as much as Jesus and the Virgin Mary. And conversely, His Holiness the Dalai Lama famously gives lectures on the Gospels to groups of Christians, and tears come to his eyes when he recounts some of the parables. And so in this world where I think more and more of us are barricading ourselves within our fortresses of ideology or assumption or intolerance, I'm so touched to see these two figures so eager to learn from everyone around them and from traditions radically different from their own. And to this day, as you probably know, the Dalai Lama can instantly conjure up his memory of meeting Thomas Merton 56 years ago. And he says very sweetly and engagingly how growing up in Lhasa, he really thought, oh, Buddhism is the greatest philosophy on earth. And then he met Thomas Merton, and suddenly the whole of the Christian tradition was opened up to him, and he opened up the Buddhist tradition to Merton. So I want them to be my models, as you say, of how to look across the street and beyond our boundaries. And in terms of the guides that I meet, I always worry that I live mostly in Japan and a little bit in California. They're very, very easy, comfortable places. So when I travel, I want to go to uneasy, discomforting places, because I'm always scared I'm living in a kind of gated bubble, in places where you see relatively few of the world's problems, and it's easy to forget those problems exist. And so I'm deliberately taking myself, I used to take myself to the poorest countries in every hemisphere, and here I was taking myself to war zones, just to remind myself that, as you said, most of the typical people you meet on the street there have had very tragic lives that the likes of me could barely imagine. And it forces me to rethink my life, to appreciate more the many blessings I have to offer. I've never been part of a war. And also to just remember that 99% of the people on the planet would give anything to be sitting in this room. I remember many years ago, I was in my parents' house in the hills of California, and suddenly the worst fire in California history broke out just up the road, and I was caught in the middle of it for 3 hours. And by the end of that evening, I'd lost everything in the world. So it was a difficult situation. Suddenly my life was upended. But even then, a couple of days later, I woke up and I thought, here I am in this resort town in California. I've got insurance. I can still do my job. I would be the envy of almost anybody I would meet in Sri Lanka or Varanasi or most of the places I visit. And I think it's important to have that sense of perception, because I sometimes worry, I suppose, two things: that the more the world goes global, the more it's easy for us to become provincial. I think our news in this country is more and more domestic. We've almost forgotten a lot of the rest of the world exists. And secondly, the other reason I gave this book the title was that we live in the age of information, and I do feel we know less about the rest of the world than ever before. And we know least of all about the countries we hear most about, such as Iran or North Korea or Cuba, because we hear about their leaders or the battered economies or their nuclear policies, but we know so little about regular folks and daily life. And if we get the world through a small screen, first, we can't catch the larger picture. And secondly, we're only getting it in 2 dimensions. We're actually missing out everything that's important, which is the humanity and texture. So really, let's say I hear the word Sri Lanka, and all I know is the civil war, or not the more than imperfect governments. Then I arrive there, and as you said, I meet somebody who's driving me across the country. Suddenly, Sri Lanka takes on a very different meaning. I remember, sorry for the long answer, I remember I was in Yemen earlier this century, and it's the most difficult place I'd ever been. And as ever, traveling there with an American passport, I met people who had nothing who were ready to give me everything. Just the kindest people across the board. And 5 weeks after I returned from Yemen, I was in my mother's house in Santa Barbara. And I was literally trying to think, how could I put Santa Barbara in the same sentence as Yemen? They seem to belong to different centuries and universes. And just at that moment, my mother raced into the room and she said, that crazy place you just came back from, it's on all our TV screens because there were these planes flying into the World Trade Center. And we're being told that Yemen is this epicenter of darkness because there's this guy called Osama bin Laden who's launching these attacks in his ancestral home village, Yemen. And I was so grateful just at that moment, as really a bungling tourist, that I could put a face and a voice to Yemen. It wasn't just a dark space in the map. It wasn't just an abstraction. It was the man who led me around the cemetery one day, and an old man who risked his life to drive me across the country at the dead of night. And a woman in the Yemeni Airlines office, and I had to change my ticket. She painstakingly handed me $40 back because my new ticket cost less than the old one. And she could so easily have pocketed it, and it would have meant so much more to her than to me. And so I suppose when I bring those guides and drivers onto the page, it's just a way to try to remind us all of the human reality, which gets lost when we're talking of right and left or red and blue or whatever it might be.
I find you being very modest when you keep referring to yourself as a tourist. Mike? Oh, okay. Does this work? Can you hear it now? No. Nope. Let's see. Can you hear this? Yeah. Good. Well, I was saying I find you awfully modest referring to yourself as a tourist, what you're describing, and particularly opening with that story of the Great Fire and losing everything. I've often thought that the difference between a tourist and a pilgrim is that the pilgrim expects to be changed by the journey. Tourists tend not to, or they maybe want to come home with loot, souvenirs and bags full of stuff. But the pilgrim is somebody who really expects not to be the same person when they return, or maybe not to return at all. And I know you open your book with an epigraph from Henry David Thoreau, one of the really, you and I share his writings as early guides. You mentioned both Thoreau and Emerson as well as Emily Dickinson, but Thoreau, who has a great essay on walking where he sort of prepares you, if you're going to even go on a walk, you pay your bills, you make sure the dog is fed, you turn on your security alarm, you have whatever, but you don't leave your house to go on a walk with any anticipation that either you will come back or that you'll come back the same person. And when I watch you in this book going through these various places, and some of the places are very joyous, and there's always a little nagging doubt, like in Ladakh or in Kashmir, or other places feel, just as though they could explode with violence in a moment, like Broome, Australia, or moments in Jerusalem, and yet you're constantly on the search for a paradise. So this is sort of your half-known life in a way, is not really knowing how to define yourself as you go through these places, having this intense quest, really beautiful quest and dangerous quest at times, and at the same time not knowing what you're going to find. And that may be partly the role of your guides in each of these cities or countries. So say a little bit about the half-known life as you understand it from Melville's phrase, or maybe it's a koan and you can't explain it, but I'd love to hear you say something about it.
Thank you. Yes, I suppose I'm a pilgrim into real life, in the sense that some people go to Lourdes, some go to Mecca, some go to Lhasa, but I try to go into the heart of real life because I find that's what is going to instruct me, and I don't want to banish any possibilities. I don't want to say so-and-so is wrong because this is her holy book, or so-and-so has no relevance to me because this is his holy place. And I think the other distinctive quality of a pilgrim is he or she knows he or she is not the center of the world. In other words, leaving home with a certain degree of modesty and expecting, as you said, to be changed and also to be humbled and maybe to be put in place by the world, whether it's a forest fire or a flood or a sudden moment of violence, as you say. So Melville's quote, actually, because Melville was such a fearless explorer, not just across the world, but into the depths of the soul, he came back from that journey shaken. I felt that the poignancy of Melville is he's always trying to come to grips with God and Satan. And that is a koan. None of us can get to the bottom of it, so you're always going to be defeated in that. And so at one point in Moby Dick, he says, anyone who leaves the safe Tahiti of your life, don't do so. And I would say, if you're in the safe Tahiti of your life, that's exactly why you should do so. I was reading Thoreau's beautiful essay on walking just on Tuesday of this week, and as you say, for him, every walk is to the Holy Land. I think he says, we don't walk, we saunter. And he creates a sort of strange etymology whereby saunter means going to sainte terre, the holy place. And I love that sense. And you just mentioned Emily Dickinson. And she beautifully said, he who does not find heaven below will fail of it above. And I have many friends who believe that heaven belongs in the afterlife. And I bow before them. But I feel that our job in some ways is to find heaven right here, as our job is to find something divine in everybody we meet, and not for paradise to be a projection into the future or to the past, not that it's some lost golden age, or not that it's some heaven that awaits us after we shuffle off our mortal coil, but maybe it could be right here. So I do keep myself out of the picture quite a bit, and you're asking really good searching questions about where I stand in relation to it. But I think I would try to, I visualize myself as kind of an anonymous pilgrim traveling into places of challenging real life to see how they differed from my expectations. And in that sense, exactly so. My definition of a trip is one where you come back a different person from the one who left, which I think is exactly what you say. And it's not included in the book, so you probably don't know this, but in Varanasi, you've probably been to Varanasi. And so for those of you who haven't, it's a clamorous storm along the holy Ganges in India. And I'm of Hindu birth, and I'm of 100% Indian blood. But even I, when I'm standing along the Ghats in Varanasi, I'm just freaked out. I'm really scared. There are flames burning to the north, as reducing dead bodies to ash. There are flames burning to the south, reducing other dead bodies to ash. There are dead bodies being carried down to the river, dead bodies floating around the whole carnival of life is there. And for me, coming from placid and orderly Japan, this is a shock to the system. What do I do with this chaos? And I remember I was standing along the banks of the river once, and suddenly a rickshaw came up. And there were two Tibetan Buddhists I happened to know from New York City. One is an elderly Tibetan Rinpoche, and one was a younger American who's an abbot of a Tibetan Buddhist temple. And my American friend came up to me, and he surveyed the scene that was so unsettling to me. And he said, "Isn't this wonderful? This is the whole human pageant. This is life and death and everything in between. Essentially, this is the place where we have to find our paradise, not on top of a mountain, not on some empty beach." And I suppose that really resonated with me as I suppose the spirit that drove me through these places. So you're right, in that sense it was a pilgrimage, but not one in search of answers. And I think, again, when I travel, I'm not hoping for a resolution, but for deeper questions. And I love the fact that you invoke the word koan, which, as most of you know, is a Zen riddle that can't be answered. And that's how life is, and I think that's how most of us are. I remember when my mother celebrated her 80th birthday, one of her friends said, "Why don't you ask her some questions, just the way you're asking of me?" And I said, "That sounds inappropriate." But there were many of my mother's friends and students there, so I assented. We talked for about 20 minutes. At the end, I asked my mother, "What's the biggest thing you've learned in life?" And she said that you can never know another person. That was amazing to me. That was partly because it was the last thing I expected my mother to say. So it showed how little I knew her. Maybe it spoke about how little she knew me. Maybe it spoke about how little she knew her husband. But the older I get, the more I'm approximating to that knowledge. And at the end of in some ways, there's quite a strong Buddhist component to this book, as you particularly would have recognized. And at the very end of the book, I think almost the central line is from Edo Roshi, a Japanese teacher who came to this country, who told his startled students, "In your suffering is your paradise." Which is not what we want to think or initially think, and it takes us a while to ponder what that might mean. But insofar as this book is a pilgrimage, it was into the truth of that fact.
Good, I'll take this. Along with that sense that in your suffering is a paradise, or here in Varanasi, this is the whole pageant of life. This is not chaos. This is the truth in some way. I've been thinking a lot about Mirabai, who I have translated. There's a new edition of her out, but she has a song in which she says, "Why go off with the pilgrims? Why go traveling the countries? Ganges and Benares are found at a holy man's feet. Today I was blessed. I covered myself with dust from the holy man's feet." And yet she wandered the roads of North India her entire life, as far as we know. And similarly, Dogen, the great, sort of Zen Buddhist or Soto Zen founder, spent 20 years traveling in China and came back to tell people, "Don't go anywhere. Sit down. This is where it's at." So we've got this constant tension that goes between, getting up and going out and seeing what's out there and finding something over the horizon, over the rainbow, and realizing that the paradise we're going to find is inside us or on the cushion or on the prayer rug, whatever it is. Let me see, I want to pick up another thread. Last night we were swapping titles of books. It was a lot of fun. We were sort of envisioning the kind of books that college students read when we were both more or less in college or in high school or something, and we were just casting names to each other, Alan Watts, Carlos Castaneda, Gurdjieff, all of that. And probably many people in the audience here are familiar with those books and remember when they were ubiquitous books, and now we don't see them very much. And most of them are by people who in some ways served as spiritual teachers in the sort of 1960s, maybe early 1970s. Your book, you mentioned Thomas Merton and the Dalai Lama, but it's also built in a very literary way. We've mentioned Melville, Thoreau, Emerson, Emily Dickinson. You quote D.H. Lawrence. You've got, many, many predecessors who you very lightly weave into the book itself. And I can't tell whether when a figure comes up, this is because, say, you read D.H. Lawrence in Australia, or you read somebody like Thomas Merton in Sri Lanka, or like, what is the role of books in your own writing? You know, how do you see yourself building on the work of the past in terms of the literary figures? Because I see your citation of those people, that's holy scripture for you.
You just took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say, literature is my scripture. When I met you yesterday, you beautifully said poetry is your practice. And I sort of asked you, what's your religion? And a part of your answer was writing. The discipline, meditative in many ways, that you find every day going to your desk. And you're bringing these great spirits like Mirabai into our midst. So I wouldn't say I'm building on those people so much as drawing inexhaustibly from them. You know, I spent 8 years of my misbegotten youth, from the age of 17 to 25. I studied nothing but literature. Not an hour of history or science or social studies, languages, nothing. Literature, more literature, more literature. So I don't have many other things I can draw upon, but I'm very glad that I have those patron saints. And for example, Emily Dickinson, you could read her for 100 years and you would never begin to get to the bottom of her either. And one thing that moves me is, we've been talking, or I was talking about His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Thomas Merton, two of the great monks of recent times. There is Emily Dickinson not leaving her room for 26 years. So all she was doing was entertaining visitors known as death, eternity, light, darkness, God, the absence of God. I mean, no monastic I know lives a more intense world life among essentials than somebody like Emily Dickinson. So just as you say, when I want to figure out things, I turn to those as my spiritual leaders, spiritual guides. I was lucky enough to spend quite a bit of time with the great poet and singer Leonard Cohen. And it struck me in relation to what you were just saying that nowadays I think a lot of my friends don't know where to find spiritual guidance and inspiration. It was common in the 60s and 70s when we were growing up, less common now. And I was struck that even after Cohen died, so many people again and again were listening to his songs. And I think that's because they felt here was somebody of real wisdom and depth who had spent 5.5 years as a monk, but who also knew the world and had really tried to wrestle unsparingly with the facts of our existence. But it's harder and harder, as you say, to find such figures on our planet. And I loved it when you just cited Mirabai, because of course that's the end of Thoreau's Walden too. Why go around the world to count the cats in Zanzibar? By chance, I was in Zanzibar a couple of years ago, and I did learn various things there, but I'm with him, basically, that any truth we need to find is right here. In fact, again, you will know as a long-time Zen student, where I live in Japan, if you go to a local Buddhist temple, often written on the ground at the entrance in Japanese are the words, "Look beneath your feet." That's the only place in the here and now where you're going to find what you need, and as you perfectly intuited, that's sort of the theme of the whole book.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up Emily Dickinson that way. I was charged with teaching a course a couple of years ago on 19th century American literature, and when I surveyed it, I had to say almost all the books fit into one category, boys and boats. Most Melville, much of Thoreau, much of Mark Twain, Richard Dana, these boys and books, and so I decided to concentrate on Emily Dickinson. And what reverberated as I, began to think about her life, there's a wonderful passage in one of Gary Snyder's books where he quotes a native elder who says, "The best thing you can do is to dress up and stay home." Well, I do hope you keep traveling and bringing these books to us, and I think now is the time to open things up for the audience for some questions, unless you have a last word you'd like to say.
No, I'm not very good at dressing up, except when I have to pretend to be a normal person on mornings like this, but I'm good at staying home, so thank you for that. And I'll just sort of finish and stitch all this together by saying I was once visiting Gethsemane, Thomas Merton's monastery in Kentucky, and I was walking with a wonderful poet, actually, called Brother Paul Kinnon, who publishes books and whose novice master was Thomas Merton. And he just brought out his most recent book, A Matter of the Heart, this week, about 65 years as a monk. And we were walking across the fields of Kentucky. And this monk, then in his mid-70s, he turned to me and he said, these last 3 years, I've just been passionately in love. Oh, he really is following Thomas Merton, isn't he? And he said, no, I've just developed this unstoppable crush. I said, oh, who? He said, well, it's a woman called Emily Dickinson. And there was this Trappist monk of 65 years. All he wanted to do was, he realized she was his spiritual teacher as much as the Bible. So yes, if you have questions, we've still got a few more minutes, I hope. So.
Yes. We have about 15 minutes or so. I'll control the time. So yes, if you just please hold your hand up, I will bring you the microphone. You were the first.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I am Vijay Arora, a YWAM professor of electrical engineering, and I started my professorial life at University of Colorado Boulder, where I was a professor of physics. So what reminded me when you were talking about heaven and hell or paradise and so on, I thought it was a relative thing because I was born in India, and which is now Pakistan, and I've had to migrate to and see that hell also, which we also hear on the TV these days. Many refugees are uprooted and so on. And I thought, coming from India, I thought Boulder was heaven at that time because with 68 war, the Boulder was the first city I know who came on bikes, who created bike trails and so on, so because the pollution problem and all that kind of thing. So my question to you is, first elaborate on half-known life, because as I know half-life is radioactivity. Half of the atom will evaporate. Do you mean that half of our people will evaporate? Is that what the half-life is? Or you think that we'll do something to save the planet and we don't have to worry about heaven and hell? Because heaven and hell, as we know now very well, is not up or down. Okay, heaven and hell, and as Buddha said, by Siddhartha, that Buddha he had this bodh, wisdom. The bodh is a Sanskrit word, wisdom, and that's why he became Buddha, because he had wisdom. So wisdom means because he says the heaven and hell are in your mind. So I want you to elaborate more on what you mean by half-known life, and what is a known life, and what is half of that, and what is paradise and hell in your mind.
Thank you. Well, I'll just keep. Is it working? This one? No. Is this the one? Yeah, this is the one that's working. Good. I'll just be very brief and say, I think we're defined by what we don't know. And that's something I certainly didn't know when I was growing up. In other words, the amount of our knowledge is tiny compared with the amount that we don't know. We never will know the extent of our life or other people's lives, and that's our grace and blessing. So maybe that would be my brief answer to that. And I'll keep paradise out of it for now, but thank you. I wish I knew more about radioactivity.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So hi, my name is Harshit Chauhan, and I've done ultramarathons in Ladakh. I've seen the Buddhist monasteries, and also, so basically my question is that I have worked on my writing, on my travels as well, and a lot of my published work has been written, especially in the mountains. And I was just curious, especially in like a place like Ladakh, I love the discourse that you were having about that because it's very close to my heart. How does writing fit into your travels? And how do you go about it, and how do you maintain your consistency? Because if you're just in a room by yourself, it's a lot easier to do that if you have a certain schedule, but with travel, you don't. So how do you go about that?
Thank you. I've always traveled in order to write. My greatest adventures take place at my desk. And so sometimes people will say to me, oh, you've traveled quite a bit. because they're reading about 5% of my life and not the boring 95% of my life where I'm sitting in our little two-room apartment in suburban Japan, don't have a car, don't have a bicycle, I never leave the neighborhood. So in a practical sense, if I were to write on my stay in Boulder, I would walk everywhere around the town as much as I could, scribble down notes furiously, as many as I could, because I may not get the chance to come here again. And then when I return home, I would spend weeks or maybe months trying to figure out what moved me most, what surprised me most, and what changed me most. And I would have an answer to that 4 days after I came back, but I'd have a different answer 4 months after I came back. And so I might write an article based on the voluminous notes I took on what did Boulder give me that nobody else ever did. But I'm also mindful when you say that you've written a lot and spent a lot of time in the Himalayas, to speak to what Andrew was saying about modesty. You know, I don't speak any of the languages of the countries I visit. I'm there for 2 weeks, and people like you may have spent 2 years there. So I'm very keen not to presume too much. And all I can really offer is the perspective of a typical visitor, where you, for example, could offer the perspective of somebody who's really spent a lot of time there. When I went to Ladakh, I was lucky because I'd been to Tibet many times and Bhutan and Nepal, and so I could compare it with some of those other places. But I think maybe the biggest lesson I took away from Ladakh is, I mentioned to Andrew when I met him last night, there's a beautiful book called A Journey in Ladakh by Andrew Harvey, an Oxford scholar at the time. And what I love about it is it's not a journey to Ladakh, it's a journey in Ladakh. In other words, all the journey is about transformation. The surface details are only really the launching pad for, in this case, he changed his entire life and he threw over his fellowship at Oxford to become a kind of wandering mystic because of what he experienced in Ladakh. So I think the most essential part of any trip, as Andrew was saying several times, was how it sends you back a different person. And for example, many of us probably love Peter Matheson's book, The Snow Leopard. And one reason we love it is because it took us in the 1970s to a part of the Himalayas that almost no Westerner had been. But the real reason we love it is that it's this unwavering trip into grief and rage and confusion, because just before he took off, he lost his young wife called Deborah Love of cancer. And he goes off into the Himalayas just to thrash through his many feelings. And so the Himalaya component, the physical part, is one part, but really it's the emotional story. And what he can learn from the temples that are consecrated to impermanence and the fact that suffering is the first noble truth. So my feeling is whenever you're writing about a different place, the external details are just a gateway to the inner transformation, which is a long way from your question, but thank you for your question.
We only have time. We only have time for one more question. I would like to remind you, though, that both Pico and Andrew are signing their books downstairs. So if you have not had the opportunity to ask something from them, they'll be around. So, and please limit your questions to your questions, because you can go have a conversation with them later. Thank you. Here you go. I'm not sure it's working. Number 2? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you can tell us your approach to visiting or avoiding places that have become strongly anti-tourist, Barcelona being an example that we hear quite a lot about.
Thank you. That's really an essential question. And I live near one of the other places that's at the center of that discussion, Kyoto, which is so overwhelmed with visitors suddenly, and you're nodding, you may have experienced it, that you can barely walk down the streets in April or November. And so on the one hand, many people, including my daughter who has a coffee stand there, are very grateful for all the visitors and the business they're bringing. And the Japanese economy is broken except for the tourist industry, so Japan is eager to attract as many tourists as possible. And yet most of the citizens are really inconvenienced by it. The older people can't get on a bus. They have to wait maybe an hour at a bus stop because bus after bus arrives and they're all full with people like me eager to sample the wonders of Kyoto. So you're right that one probably owes some respect to those places and realizes, as Andrew's questions were pointing out, that in the very fact of enjoying them, we're helping to destroy them and make them something other than they are. And for me, this is particularly pronounced in Japan, because any of you who's been to Japan knows that the great graces of that society, very quiet, very orderly, and very obedient. Most of us foreigners are not so quiet, not so orderly, and not so obedient. So it's a radical change to the culture. If you get into a train from Nara to Kyoto now, it's very raucous, and it's full of people like me slouching around and making a mess of things. And people may come away saying, oh, we'd always imagined Japan would be much more serene. And it's not. The Japanese are as serene as they ever were. It's people like me who are not so. So I think there's a good case. I mean, I've always been a believer, as many travelers are, in going to the second most interesting place. You know, if everyone's going to Mexico, please go to Guatemala. Or if everyone's going to Dubai, Oman is a much richer and more interesting place to visit. And if everyone's going to Barcelona, I'm sure there are some other interesting Catalan villages that would yield equal pleasures without the press of crowds. But you're the first person who's asked that question, and I think over-tourism is one of the principal problems of right now. And it's an understandable problem because, as I say, most of us in this room want to educate ourselves about the world and want to go to those places. But what are we doing in the process to the environment and taking the trip and to the place when we arrive there? So thank you. That's the perfect koan probably on which to end. Thank you.